It's time to rip the cover off what really works to ditch addiction, depression, anger, anxiety, and all other kinds of human suffering. No, not sobriety. We're talking the F word here, freedom. We'll share straight from the trenches what we've learned from leaving our own addictions behind and coaching hundreds of others to do the same. And since it's such a heavy topic, we might as well have a good time while we're at it. All right, we're back again with Tucker, and we're here to talk about stages of freedom, right? So last week, we particularly talked about OCD, bipolar, all of the sort of gray line, sort of midline areas that are, is it medical? Is it psychological? And I do think an important point to note that we didn't bring up last week is that in all of the really old traditional healing methodologies, there really wasn't a thing such as psychology. Psychology is really mostly a Western phenomenon. People will talk about your thought processes and things like that in various traditions, but ultimately none of those are important. We're not going to spend too much time talking about them. The only reason we're going to talk is to get you to do something. And then they would put you through processes like many of the ones that I've adapted or used over the years and brought into the retreat space and everything else, that those processes shift the internal chemistry, shift the balance, and then we can talk if we need to talk and see something a little bit different. And so the reason that there's a gray line there is because mind and body, your body is your mind. There's no way around that. You have neurons everywhere in the body. So your finger moving, that is a neuron firing, and a neuron firing is a thought in a sense. And so we're working with your thoughts. Every thought you have creates muscular movement. And so if we start working with the body itself, the mind then starts to settle down a little bit. The chattering monkey of the mind, as the Zen people would call it. So we talked a little bit about that. We talked about like some of the changes that happened in the first couple of weeks. And what I want to kind of focus on this week is this notion, like a lot of people have happiness or freedom as like the end goal of all of the things in their life. The goal is to be happy. And I want to flip the tables a little bit. And I want to offer the suggestion right at the beginning that happiness is the starting line, that freedom is the starting line. All of the research points to the human body functions at its peak under conditions of happiness, which means that, you know, like let's talk about a seed for a second. If I take a seed and I plant it in the ground, the seed functions at its peak under optimal conditions of water and sunlight and soil and good nutrients in the soil. If I take those away, I will never see the seed blossom, or it'll blossom and then die, which means that I won't get to see the full range of what that seed is capable of. And I would suggest that that's the same thing happening in human life. Anybody that's saying, you know, at the end of life, we're trying to do this to be happy is missing the point. Your happiness is the fuel out of which you get to bloom. And so considering freedom and considering happiness instead of as an end goal, but rather as the starting point, which is why we start our program with Choose Your Own Emotion, so that then you can go create and experience a huge life. That's really what I want to turn the tables to. And that means you're going to see stages of blossoming, stages of freedom, more and more happening instead of, well, I made it to the end. Now there's no more point in life because I did what I came to do kind of thing. And so I want to talk about Tucker's stages, and then, you know, we can extrapolate a little further in terms of stages and what we've seen with some other people as well, so that you guys can paint a picture for yourself of, oh no, it's not stages toward happiness and freedom. It's like stages of life that get to occur as I'm nourished by happiness, right? So we started with, oh, wow, I kind of see what's at the bottom of things. I've got some clarity of thinking, and my emotions aren't running wild, and my thoughts are actually stopping from time to time. That was first, right?
Yeah, that was first. It was the foundation. Sorry.
And so then what happened? So a couple weeks ago in, that starts to happen. Then what happened in the next month or two? Like, what did you start seeing happen?
So at first, we talked about how the OCD subsided, how I was able to have better clarity in my thinking. Then the evolution of that started to kind of bleed into my marriage and into my relationships, and going from someone that I felt like, looking back, was very impatient and intolerant of like anything, meaning kids making too much noise, wife and I not getting along or communicating in a way that I felt like was effective, spending time doing things that I felt like were just a time waste, being upset at work or with my professional responsibilities. And even at the time, this was just around the time that I was finishing up my graduate program, just being frustrated with some of the things that I had chosen to do on an academic level. And so I went from this space of really negative thinking and having a lot of disconnect and just lack of harmony in my relationships to, I actually want to be a part of this family, and I want to show up in a way that's not only beneficial for myself, but really beneficial for my kids and for my wife. And what that looked like for me was taking the time to go out and spend time with them. That was like the first thing. When I was dealing with pornography, when I was dealing with all of the mental health garbage that I was going through, one of the things that I did most frequently was isolate myself. I'm not going to spend time with my family. My wife can attest to the fact that for probably the first 5 years of our marriage, the things she wanted to do, the things she wanted to go out and participate in, the family she wanted to go visit, the friends she wanted to spend time with, I was not on board with. It was all about me, my time, doing what I wanted to do, which all too often was nothing and just sitting alone by myself. So that started to change. I was just open to the possibility of saying yes. So I started saying, yes, let's go out and do this. And so I got to learn for the first time in my life that, yeah, some of the things that my wife wanted to do, I, in fact, actually didn't want to do, but there were things that I did. I started to have better relationships, not only with my family, but with friends, people that I had disconnected with because of the time that I spent in the negative headspace, the time that I'd spent looking at pornography, and really just kind of avoiding life is now an open possibility. And so instead of just looking at everything and saying, no, I don't want to be a part of that, it was, I get to test that out, see what's there. If I like it, great. I'll participate in it more. Maybe that'll change down the road. If I don't like it, I'm just going to walk away from it. But it was the option to actually do that. It was now a choice. It was something that I got to choose to do rather than just, I'm completely opposed to this or I'm completely open to everything, kind of in that middle of like, oh, this is actually something that I get to decide to do.
So if we look at that, like, okay, cool. When you're in whatever struggle that you're in, you're really dealing with all of the life energy you have is being drained by this one thing. So you don't really have the energy to do anything else, to think about anything else, to say yes to anything else, to pack up the kids, to get in the car, to answer questions that you don't want to have asked to you, to like whatever else, right? So the energy is all lost. So all of a sudden, like we're doing some simple things, happiness and clarity start to show up. And that means that there's not so much energy leak, right? Which means that the desire to re-engage with life naturally starts to show up. And that's what you started to see.
Yeah. And a really solid example of this for me personally, this past week, kind of fast forwarding a couple of years to kind of the now, I had the opportunity to go out for the day and go paddle boarding and spend some time my sister's property, a beautiful pond kind of in the center of their community. And for about 3 hours out on the water, I was sitting there thinking about how I wanted this for myself. Why can't this be mine? Why can't I wake up to this every morning and come out and go swimming on the pond? Just kind of like angsty and just irritated, like, oh, people get these nice things and I don't get that. Probably to you listeners, it can sound really petty, but for me, it was like this big thing. Like, why isn't this mine? And it was this dawning realization, probably 3.5 hours in, as I was on the paddleboard thinking, I spent this whole time doing the thing that I'm complaining about not having access to, but I've had access to. And instead of enjoying it as it's been happening, I've been thinking about when I won't have access to it anymore. And it completely just no longer made any sense in my mind. And I enjoyed the rest of the afternoon. Now, that's not something I could say I would have been able to process or handle even just a couple years ago. Even after I had started working with Bob, there was still a lot of, oh, life's not fair. I wish I had it this way. I wish things would go more my way. This is how I wish life would look. And even out of that has evolved this space of situation by situation, moment by moment, what's happening right now. And again, getting to choose not only how I respond to things emotionally, but also not being reactive. I think for me, one of the biggest things that I learned early on, and this is something that I share with anyone that I have the opportunity to work with, is this idea of removing the reactivity, creating space. So especially with pornography, oftentimes I looked at it as like, okay, something happens and boom, all of a sudden I've gone to pornography, or something's happened and all of a sudden I'm binge watching Netflix or spending too much time on social media or cramming my face full of junk food. I mean, at my worst, and kind of go back to the mental health stuff, I was eating two king size candy bars and a Red Bull every day. That was like my main meal. And so something would happen and then I'm in that space and then I'm feeling really crappy about everything, externally and internally now because of all the garbage I've put into my body. And it always felt like something happens and boom, I'm right there where I don't want to be. After I started working with Bob, and this is kind of the evolution I want to explain a little bit more in depth, is that space between trigger and reaction, between stimulus and response. That's what started to grow. Something happens that would normally put me in a negative emotional space. Something happens that would normally send me reeling and back to pornography or to other unhelpful habits. And now all of a sudden something's happening and I'm breathing. And that breathing gives me 30 seconds. And the next day it gives me 90 seconds. And then it gives me 5 minutes to start to decide to choose to do something different so that I'm not just feeling like I'm being led back to the same place, the same thing again and again and again. That for me is the embodiment of probably the best part of everything that I've experienced here is just increasing time. My kid does something to annoy me, or they're freaking out and all of a sudden I'm freaking out and I'm yelling or I'm upset. Now it's my kids freaking out. Oh, I'm taking a breath. Okay, this isn't as big of a deal as I thought it was. I'm not exacerbating the issue. I'm not making it worse. I'm not now frustrating my wife and now the whole household feels like it's going to explode because I took just 5 seconds to stop, to breathe, to check my posture, to relax my shoulders, to lift my head. And so that piece for me is probably the biggest, is just creating space. And little by little, that space started to grow to where I was less reactive and I could actually think about how I wanted to respond to life and to the situations that I was encountering.
So, in neuroscience, there's been a large debate among neuroscientists about whether or not people actually have choice, free will, and philosophers from time immemorial, right? Are we all just robots, living out a story or not? And I don't think it'll ever be settled. People have long-standing views about things and beliefs about it, and they tend to find evidence for what they believe in. But what they did find, I think back in the 1960s, was there was an experiment where they were trying to figure out, like, okay, cool, what is the sequence of events that leads to an action? And the assumption at the time was, well, they're going to feel a desire, and then there will be a buildup of activity in the nerve, and then eventually the nerve will fire, right? And so they hooked some people up, and they had them do a simple task. They were going to press a button, A or B, but in order to be able to measure when they felt the desire, they said, okay, cool. When you feel the urge to push the button, look at a certain point. I think it was a clock on the wall. And so that was the only other element that they added. So here we are, we have a group of people, their job is push a button, but right when you feel the urge to push whichever button it is, right when you've made the decision, look up at the clock, right? And what they found was that neurologically, there was a buildup of activity in the nerve, and then they felt the urge, and then they pushed the button. Which means that, as I've been telling people for way too long, that your body is always in response to the environment. It is, the moon changes, the tide goes up in the planet. What makes you think the blood and fluids inside your system aren't affected, right? Your body is in a constant dance with the entire cosmos. And so then what happens is this buildup of activity in the system, which is just a natural habitual response, learned response. And you don't have to have a nervous system to have a learned response. Sea slugs can learn to avoid electric shock, we've discovered. Who came up with that stupid experiment? Let's go shock sea slugs. Man, humans, the Holocaust of our scientific journey is, anyway. So you can learn. Your body has these habitual responses, but in the space between the buildup called an action potential and the release of the actual nervous system energy that will create the action, that's when the urge is felt. And that's where a new decision can be made. And that seems to be rooted in the number of neurons you have in your neocortex. And since humans have billions more neurons in their neocortex than any other animal that we've studied so far, on the order of, like, we have around 16 billion in the neocortex, apes, orangutans and whales have like 8 or 9 billion. And so they have all these similar behaviors as humans, just not quite as developed in the way we do. If songbirds could have bodies as big as humans, they would have more neurons in their neocortex because of the way that their neurons are set up. So if there were eagles as big as men, then they would be way smarter than we are. The point is, to that extent, we have a choice. And the choice isn't stop. It's not, oh, don't do this. It's, there's energy here. What do I want to do with this energy? So you're talking about, you created a space what you did was take the energy of that action potential and use it to do something breathing wise, which actually built your system. It gave you more energy. And then you would relax your posture. So you're using the energy of that action potential to actually enhance your system. And then that puts you in a clearer space to make a decision.
Yeah. And I think it really changed from a point of resistance. Like, okay, all of a sudden there's this urge or desire, or I feel like there's this urge or desire, and now I have to resist. This is wrong. This is bad. All of the background noise, all of the baggage that I carried with me. Okay, why can't I do this? This isn't something I should be doing. If I do this, it means I'm a bad person. It means I'm a bad husband or a bad father. It means I'm weak, right? All of those things that I think tie back into the conversation around the root issue, all of that being there. And I have to resist this. And now all of a sudden I'm resisting this thing and I'm still focused on the thing itself. Even if it's now in the framework of resisting the thing, I'm still thinking about the thing, and now I'm fixated on it, and now I'm back to it again. And I'm going to give in, because if I don't give in, then I can't get on with my day. Either I have to start my morning by going to pornography or an energy drink just to get up and get going, or going through Facebook at least 5 times through the same feed over and over again. And then I can get out of bed, right, just to get going. That kind of mentality toward this thing, because if I resist, then it's just going to eat at it all day. And so many of the clients that I've worked with have kind of, well, it just started in the morning and then it continued until lunch, and then from lunch until work was over, and then from work to when I got home. And I resisted and I resisted and I kept fighting those urges. And then when I got home, I finally just caved and gave in, right? So that piece, the resistance piece, replacing it, however you want to say that, of changing and breathing and introducing something new into that environment and creating that space, or having that space opened up and expanded, I didn't have to resist anymore. I just did something differently, and then the desire itself went away. It wasn't always that simple. Sometimes it took more breathing. Sometimes it took breathing and a combination of something else. But because I could go to the breath work initially, it gave me 10 seconds to think, oh, I'm going to go out for a walk and I'm going to do some more breathing. Or I'm going to go and I'm going to do some quiet meditation. Or I'm going to go take a walk in the woods. I'm going to get in the car. I'm going to do something different than what I would have done before. Breathing gave me just that time, enough time to actually make the decision to go and do something else. So sometimes it compounded. Sometimes it was just the breathing. But in either situation, it was enough to get me to the next place where I could make another decision.
Yeah. And so instead of thinking resistance, think in terms of like, there's a buildup of energy. You're always using the energy. But most people are using the energy to create, oh, I shouldn't do this. And that creation of that is a negative experience in the human body. And that builds up energy. And so then that energy comes, and then you use that energy to create, oh, I shouldn't do this more. And so then that creates a more negative experience, which uses energy. And so you're exhausted by the end of it, 1. And 2, you're always using your energy. What you call an urge is just the word energy. It's just literally an urge inside, right? It's the sense of a push towards something. That's all that it is. It's just a sensation in the body, and you're always using that energy. And then the question is, where do we use it? So what we work on is helping people get that space so that they can start to do that. So the first couple months, that starts to happen. How long did it take before you felt like, so how long did it take before pornography wasn't an issue?
That from the outset. I mean, pornography came up occasionally, but never in the way where it felt like it was outside of my control. I mean, there's a few times where, oh man, this is really hard, and I'm not getting it the way that I should be getting it. That's usually when I would go into this really negative, overwhelming headspace. But after probably 3 to 4 months, it finally started feeling like this is something that I could go and do. I'm choosing not to go and do it. That level of freedom really started to settle in probably half a year to a year after I started your process. And it was in some conversations with my wife where I no longer felt like, not just with pornography, but a lot of the other habits that I picked up along the way were no longer controlling me. It was like, I could go stuff my face with junk food. I could go and look at pornography, but it was the awareness around why I was choosing not to that really created the longevity, really made this stick. And what I mean by that is eventually got to the point where I cleared out a lot of the religious background behind this being morally wrong. I had to do that to walk away from a lot of the guilt and shame that really was just making things worse for me. And when I was able to kind of disconnect pornography from a moral or even spiritual deficiency inside of myself, that's when I really started to look at, if I'm not looking at it this way, then what really is the problem with pornography? And the light bulb moment here in this situation was, how is it impacting my relationships in the present? How is it impacting my relationship with my wife? How is it showing up in my relationship with my kids? Am I being an asshole? Am I doing things in a certain way because I've looked at pornography that's making life not only miserable for myself, but miserable for the people around me, and in effect, just making things really crappy and heavy? And so I started looking at the real-time present consequences of the decisions and choices that I was making. And I started kind of throwing that umbrella over a lot of the decisions and choices, not just with pornography, but when I do this, do I feel better? Do I feel happier? Do I feel more content? Do I feel envious? Do I feel jealous? Do I feel like I want to go do other worse things? Do I feel like I want to be with my family? Do I want to take care of them? Do I want to take care of my responsibilities? Do I want to show up professionally? And those questions started coming up. And so it was the real life, in your face situations and circumstances that it really became clear. Like, if I go and look at pornography or I engage in these certain types of behaviors, even without that moral, spiritual, religious context, it actually doesn't really make me feel a whole lot better. And in fact, it complicates a lot of what's going on in my life, complications that I don't actually feel like I want. And so that gave me the longevity to really start to stick with, this is not how I want to live. And so I'm going to choose to do something else. And again, going back to that whole idea, I felt like I now had a choice.
If you or someone you know is looking to drop the F-bomb of freedom in their life, whether that's from past trauma, depression, anxiety, addiction, or any other host of emotional and personal struggles, but they just don't know how or want some help doing it, head on over to thefreedomspecialist.com/feelbetternow and check out some of the things we've got in store for you, or book a call so we can look at your unique situation and get you the help that you're looking for.
So there's two things here to bring up. One, the first is, at this point, you're like, oh, okay, so he's almost free. No. Remember, we started at the beginning with, as you are working on nourishing your own happiness, then the blossoming starts to happen. So the blossoming of greater levels of freedom was happening all along. It's not that he wasn't feeling happy. It's not that he didn't have like tremendous moments of freedom along the way. And more bigger spans of it. And on the way to some journey, it's that like he was already experiencing and nourishing freedom. And as a result of the more he nourished his happiness, the more these other changes started to happen. There wasn't a conscious, okay, now the next thing I need to do is focus on the real life present moment consequences. Because everything he's describing, if you've noticed, they're like, all of a sudden it dawned on me this. That wasn't we don't dawn people. People, we don't do that, right? That we work on your biology, we work on your physiology, we work on the building blocks out of which the byproducts come, which are your thought processes. And we talked about that a little while ago on a podcast. So if you want to go back and look at those ones on byproducts and building blocks or something like that. The second thing to bring up here is the notion of religious guilt and shame. Now, this is a heavy topic for a lot of people because they come, especially when they're dealing with pornography and sexual addiction and stuff. Addiction in general has just maintained a lot of religious overtones. Most of the other things, people don't think that there's something morally wrong with them for having depression or anxiety or OCD or something like that. They might feel like they're broken. They might feel like there's something wrong with them as a being, but not morally. The religious guilt and shame piece is interesting. I want you to go back to the action potential in the nerve. There's a buildup of a desire. If out of that desire, you create a series of thought processes that you were trained to create around fear, around self-flagellation, around beating yourself up like, oh, I'm such a bad person, or oh, I shouldn't be having these thoughts and stuff. What you've done is take the energy of life and create negativity and pain inside yourself. And the word Satan means accuser. So you've taken the role of Satan and used the energy of life to be an accuser for yourself on the inside. The reason you've done that is not because you're a bad person, but because that's the only way you knew how to control your behavior in the first place, right? That's how you learned. People taught you how to do it. You know, if you make fun of them, you know, maybe they'll shoot the basket better. If you call them names or tease them, you know, maybe they'll get the point and move on. You know, if you get in their face and scream and yell at them, then they'll be afraid of it and then they won't do it again. There's all kinds of ways that as human beings, we've learned to use negative emotional experiences to motivate behavior. So there's nothing wrong with that. I talked about that on the episode of Manipulative Madness, right? And so we've done that. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. That means that's how you learn to control your behavior. So great. Accept that very process of control is creating another buildup that then you will have to go do something with. And if you never learn something else to do with it, then you're stuck in that cycle. So being stuck is just, I don't like any of the options I have. To get unstuck, you don't have to kill the whole beating yourself up thing. You don't have to fix it. Just give yourself another option. Your body will naturally take the better of the two, the one that feels the best, which is why people go to addictive behaviors. Let's see, beat myself up or take 30 minutes, snort a line of Coke and feel great. Rough decision. Maybe I'll beat myself up later because I don't have the money for another snort or whatever, but like, that's it. That's not what we're talking about here. Right? If you're only giving yourself the two options, do or don't, wow, like nobody taught you about creativity. Back in it was a while ago, they took 4 and 5-year-olds and they measured them for creativity. They took 1,600 of them and they measured them for creativity, and their scores were off the charts genius. Every single one of them, like 98% genius level for creativity. 5 years later, now they're now 10, they measure them again, and they're in the 30th percentile or something around that. 5 years later, they're now 15, and they measure them again, and now they're at 12% on the creativity scale. Then they took 1 million adults, average age 31, and measured them for creativity. Their average score was 2%, which suggests that as you grow, it's not age that kills your creativity, it's education, it's training. It's the way you've trained yourself to think that eliminates options. And so kids tend to have more synapses, more nervous system possibilities and more neural connections than adults do. They weed them out over a period of time, or as the Zen people would say, in a beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In an expert's, there are few, right? The point is, it's your education that's done it. So all we have to do is give you another option. And the option we're giving you is another thing to do with the energy. So can you see how this doesn't have anything to do with religious shame and guilt? This isn't about, is it morally wrong or isn't it? This is about whether or not it's morally wrong in some absolute sense. What are you going to do with the urge? What are you going to do with the sensation or desire? Because beating yourself up about it, there is ample evidence to suggest that itself perpetuates the problem. And that's what they've seen. Like back in 2008 in Psychology Today, there was an article, science stopped believing in porn addiction. You should too, right? In that article, they reviewed some of the research that indicates that the more a person has a religious belief about how bad the behavior is, the more likely they are to engage in it. That has nothing to do so much with belief as it does to do with the consequences of belief, which is it's more likely that the more a person beats themselves up about doing something, the more likely they are to engage in it, right? And that can be a consequence of religious belief. And I think that that's an important distinction to make. What are you going to do with the urge is the question, not, oh, is it good or bad that I have it? I mean, that's real. So did you want to say more about that?
Yes, and I think for me, just kind of to wrap up that part of my experience, especially with pornography, it was the translation of this thing that I had been taught was bad, pornography, into I'm bad because I'm looking at this bad thing. And so it went from guilt about a behavior to this deeply entrenched shame about a behavior. And for me, that was something that I've explored over the last couple of years. And I've looked at how that shaped my experience with handling pornography, how that shame and that guilt really created the situations that led me to a lot of the mental health help that I had sought out at that time in my life, and how I'm doing it differently with my kids. The way that I talk about sex and sexuality, those types of conversations, all of these things compounded by the way I was taught or the way that it was approached as a young kid, as I was trying to figure out life, which I'm still doing, right? And but in a space where it felt like there was a lot of heaviness around this thing that I was struggling with, and then being told that it was bad and it was wrong. And that really, for me, was internalized as I'm this bad, wrong person, and there's something really wrong with me. Something specifically about pornography that shows up around religion that some of these other things like drugs don't necessarily in this way, as this spiritual ineptitude, that there's this deficiency and that I'm never going to hit the mark. Like that really came up, and that really influenced so much of what happened both in my experience of trying to handle it before I started working with Bob, and then what kind of evolved out of my experience with Bob and these new things that I was learning, not only about myself, but about what was possible to me if I could just drop that piece. And again, you talk about moral absolutes and all of that, but for me, just that the significance of that awareness of just knowing, like, if I can just look at what's happening here and now, has far more impact on the choices and decisions I'm making than some possibility of future consequence or damnation. And that is what finally switched how I was showing up for myself and in my relationships in such a way where I'm here, I'm present. And although I have to remind myself to do that and to be that way at times, it's a very different situation when it's not added or compounded by all of this emotional baggage and what ifs might happen if I continue down this path.
Yeah. And if we take that back to your core issue, right? The same thing is here, right? I'm worthless and I'll never amount to anything. The core thought process, again, something happens in life, energy builds. And if what you do with that energy is create a thought process of I'm worthless and I'll never amount to anything, or any variant on the same, then what you've created is a negative experience in the body, which will then build up and start to spiral in a different way.
And in my own experience, just to finalize, one thing that I think is really important, because I've seen this show up in a lot of my conversations with clients, with friends, with family. With the religious side, the spiritual side, there was kind of always this drive to commit to never doing this thing again. I promise I'm not going to do this again. I'm committed to not doing this again. And that in and of itself was me making an infinite, immeasurable decision. In a given moment, I'm trying to define this thing that's indefinable. I don't know where I'm going to be in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. I don't know if I'm going to walk out the door and get hit by a bus today, right? Let alone 50 years from now, I'm going to be this person that is not still looking at porn. And this was this huge, weighty decision that didn't ever have to be made. And that's something that I think has been important in my conversations, especially with clients, is you don't have to make that decision today. Each situation is an opportunity to choose. Maybe I'm not choosing not to look at porn. I'm choosing to go get an ice cream, or I'm choosing to do any infinite amount of other possibilities right now than choosing to look at porn. But it's still a choice in a moment rather than this weighty, immeasurable, I'm choosing this thing for the rest of my life, because we don't know how that's going to go. Once I took that weight off, possibilities for life and opportunity seem to really open up.
Yeah. And that choice, that ability to make a choice, comes from training your system to take the energy of an urge and to do something that builds your system in a really powerful way, like we teach people from the very beginning, right? And so up to this point, this is like a year in or so, and it's been 4 years now, right? So this is a year in, he's seeing changes happen as a result of consistently just 3 minutes a day breathing, going on some walks, like finding the things that really lift him up in certain ways, and some fairly consistent, simple little things in his life that have trained his system that he's not a victim to anything and that he can actually choose to do something different. As we wrap up, like, it's been 4 years now, right? There's a ton of stuff that has changed in your life in some really profound ways. And what are some of the surprising ones? Like things you set out to go get rid of porn and get rid of maybe the anger stuff, right? And the OCD stuff, or get it under handle, but it was mostly porn. A couple weeks ago, or on one of the episodes, it might air after this or before. I'm not quite sure when it'll air because we recorded them in a batch. We're talking about how you can't just change one thing. Like the whole thing changes. You make one change and all of the rest of your life starts to change in adaptation to it. What are all these surprising, beautiful things that shifted for you that you never expected would shift when you just set about to be like, okay, I'll just get rid of the porn thing?
I think the first one that comes to mind is communication with my spouse. And there's been some heavy conversations about our marriage, our relationship, about our future that I think would have sent me spiraling in the past of, what is our marriage? What does that look like? What is marriage itself? And what do we see for us and our family in the future? And these sometimes heavier questions around finances and being able to provide for a family that I think even just 5 or 6 years ago put me in a really dark place. A really dark place is like, crap, like my future is so undefinable and so uncertain, and I'm scared and I'm terrified. I don't know what to do. And so going through a period of my life where, even in my education, choosing 6 or 7 different majors and then switching back to the first one after I was no longer happy with the 7th one, and all of these things, like never being able to commit and always being terrified of what would come next. all of the past, the fear of past, like I wish I would have done this, I should have done this, I should have done this differently, fixating on those things going away so that there's no longer this fear. And even when situations are difficult, even when there are difficult conversations in my marriage and in my relationships, even when there's uncertainty around our financial future, or how we're going to save for the kids, or, continue to provide in a way for my family that I feel like is meaningful, it doesn't send me into a dark place anymore. It might create questions and it might create exploration, but if I could summarize, the biggest takeaway is that life is now an exploration. It's not just a black and white, this way or that way. There's a lot of different possibilities. And I have the privilege of being able to look at each day, each moment, each situation as a new opportunity and as a new exploration of life and what it has to offer. And so I think that's kind of it's simple. And out of the initial things that I learned and went through when I started this process with Bob came some things that are very different from where I began. And some of the things that I started with are now different, that I've made my own. And that's something that I think is so important for people to recognize is even if we ask you or invite you to do things a certain way, especially in the beginning, you get to take that, you get to grow out of that. And that's exactly what I've done. Some of the breathing that I do now is very different from what I did initially. The walking, cold water therapy, nature has been such a significant aspect of my journey, the journey that I'm on now. But going back to the beginning of the episode, freedom not as a destination, but just as an exploration for me is this how I would define it, an exploration of life, and one that's continually happening, and so much opportunity and possibility in each day and each opportunity that presents itself.
Yeah. We really work with each client that comes on with coaching for us to really help them see that freedom is a unique expression. Now, for you may not have an example of this, so I'm putting you on the spot here. What are the sort of because we talk a lot about things going away, heavy things disappearing, and often the focus loses its capacity to see all the beautiful miracles that show up that are just like unexpected surprises. Do you have any examples of those that have happened as a result?
I think back to an experience I think that I've shared before, probably at one of our retreats. And I think it was actually at our first retreat, being in a car with my family, and we just were playing music and not anything different. I mean, drive with the kids in the car all the time. Music is on almost every time we get in the car. But I started singing and I started dancing and within safe bounds because I'm driving the vehicle. And the kids are all engaged. And it was like we weren't separate. And I've never really looked at it that way until talking about it now. But it was like we were just like in the embodiment of joy, of just pure and utter bliss, where everything just kind of faded to the background. And not trying to use words that aren't relatable or not understandable. It was just like the individual part of me, the heavy part of me, the baggage that I'd carried around, it just kind of melted into the background. And I felt like I was a part of my kids. I felt like the family as a whole was just collectively there in just this beautiful space. And it was pure presence. It was just like, this moment is all that is. And I'd heard that, and I heard people talk about it still, and it never really does justice to try to define it in words. But being in that space was just an embodiment of what life is. And now looking at that, what life holds as just an open possibility. It isn't a one and done experience. And so I think since that time, I haven't had a situation exactly like that, but I've been more aware of the moments where presence has played that role of there's just so much here in this moment that I tend to focus less on what has been, what might be, and really just embrace what is here now.
So what I'll suggest, I've been on this road for, a decade. And I'll suggest this, that further on for me, what happened as I doubled down on happiness being the fuel for the dang car instead of the destination to get on an empty car that we had to push the whole way, is not just that all the pornography stuff went away, not just that the anger went away, not just that the self-loathing and the feeling of being broken went away, not just that the relationships that I had with Jasmine changed or our intimacy changed or our ability to communicate. It was that joy started springing through me unasked for. It would just bounce through my system and take over, and I would just be overwhelmed with happiness doing simple little things. And then, like, at a certain point, it just became clear that life was this beautiful moment happening, and all the stuff in the past felt like it belonged to another person. And I just happened to have access to their memory banks. And so people ask, like, how do you know if you're free? And I've mentioned this before, like, you know you're free when it never even arises in your consciousness. You don't think about, oh yeah, this thing I overcame. Like, it literally is like, oh, what? Oh yeah, I have access to somebody else's memories. That was a thing. It feels like it happened to another person. And instead, it feels like I'm living a life as an entirely different being, that there's no past that I have to overcome. And there's just a bunch of moments that are beautiful to explore. Have you seen some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, especially as recently, just the small kind of subtle day-to-day things of the other night driving home from the pond that I referenced earlier, and it was a supermoon. And I remember freaking out. If you've ever seen The Kid, and he's freaking out about the moon, I was that kid in that moment, just freaking out about the moon and how ginormous it was. My kids are in the background laughing. My wife is sitting there laughing. And it was just this beautiful moment. And those are starting to happen without me trying to influence them. It was just spontaneous. I think you used that word. It was just a spontaneous moment where everything just kind of melted away, and it was just me and the moon and me and my family. And in that moment, just this beautiful, goofy situation turned into just now a very fun memory, not something that I fixate on, but something that, I know is possible. And in the past, those situations probably were there and accessible to me all the time. I just didn't pay attention. I was so distracted with all the background noise that I didn't pay attention. I didn't notice those things. And I think if that kind of answers that question, I think that was probably a big one. And I like that example because it was just really fun.
Yeah. If Tucker now, before he was super serious and like always like controlled about things and concerned about stuff. And he's just a big kid. And maybe because he didn't get a chance to be a kid for so many years because he was busy focused on other things. And I've seen a lot of people do this, feel like they're back at their youth again, and they get to experience life just in this undiluted, unmediated way. And that can happen. And so, but that happens by focusing on, instead of fighting something. There's nothing wrong with anybody on this planet. There's just an experience happening. And the energy of that experience is present. The action potential is there. What are you going to do with it? You can fight it. You can create anxiety and problems and whatnot, or you can take that energy and go create something that is beneficial for yourself. And as you double down on that, then all of a sudden it grows in your life, and your life becomes something unrecognizable. And so, obviously I've built programs. We've talked to you about these a lot. Come to a retreat. Honestly, it is the fastest way I know of to address all the parts of your system, the unconscious ones, the biological cellular ones, the nervous system ones, the thought processes, and all the other stuff associated with it, all the stuff and support we give around those retreats, so that, that's several months of support there, so that you just get a chance to like make a change direction. And the fastest way to get your body to take the energy of all that old stuff, and instead of fighting it, turn all of that prodigious energy, and it's a lot of energy, into creating something new. It's there. The possibility's there, and you just got to take the step to do it.
And that's it for today's Alive and Free podcast. If you enjoyed this show and want some more freedom bombs landing in your earbuds, subscribe right now at wherever you get your podcasts from. And while you're at it, give us a rating and a review. It'll help us keep delivering great stuff to you. Plus, it's just nice to be nice.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.